SpaceX has Falcon 9 booster landings down to a science, but we're really quick to declare that they've hit the bullseye when they land on the drone ship or back at the LZ, but how accurate are the landings actually? And can we look at Falcon 9 landings and make any interesting estimates about how a super heavy booster might land? I'm John Galloway with NSF, and we've done an awful lot of analysis to try and figure out if the SpaceX landings are accurate enough for the upcoming catch attempt of the super heavy booster as part of the Starship program. If you went back 10 years and you said, yeah, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to build a huge crane system that's going to catch the booster by these little teeny tiny catch targets. Trust us, it'll work. I think 10 years ago, people would have thought you were insane. But nowadays, we've got rockets landing on barges that are pixels in the middle of the ocean. So I'm not kidding. It's amazing that SpaceX can so reliably get the Falcon 9 booster onto the drone ship or the landing zone. Of course, it's super impressive to see happen every single time. I mean,
bingo, right in the center.
Thanks, Jack. And I think putting that rocket on that pixel in the middle of the ocean is a darn impressive feat, but is it actually a bullseye? Now, SpaceX has done this well over 300 times, the vast majority of which have been successful. So here's what we did. We looked at video of over 100 of the most recent Falcon 9 booster landing attempts to see if we could divine any accuracy numbers for them. I mean, how close to the middle of the bullseye are they actually? And once we got those numbers, here's what we did. We put it in between the chopsticks, and we tried to see what's the possibility that they can put that booster in between the chopsticks. Now, up front, there's a lot of qualitative analysis here that we tried to quantify as best we could, but we were limited. We don't have actual statistics from SpaceX on exactly how far off center the booster is, but we came up with a pretty good proxy for it. And not all the booster landings were actually useful. I mean, some of them look like this. You can see the sides pretty well, and there's about where the booster is, right? But a lot of them end up looking like this. Can't really make any inferences from that. But in the end, we found 84 Falcon 9 booster landing videos that we thought were useful enough to get some data about how accurately they actually landed these things. Now, I know a lot of you are already down in the comments, like not a few minutes into the video, already telling me why this is wrong. We're going to talk about that, but there's still some really interesting engineering challenges that we can get to from the data that we collected. Just bear with me. Don't make me reply to your comment, you didn't get to the end of the video, did you? Now, again, we're looking at videos, but here's what we did. You got a booster, and it's on a drone ship. You want to make sure that you're consistently using comparable camera angles, and luckily we found that on most of the drone ships, the camera angles were pretty reused. They were pretty consistent on where the camera was bolted to a railing or mounted or whatever. We also had to throw out a lot where we just couldn't see what was going on. I mean, this is too blurry. I can't give you anything. I would just be guessing. But if you get a nice clear video, here's the plan. We take the sides of the drone ships. There's a side, there's another side. Okay, there are railings there and they're nice straight lines, and we can sort of compare those to each other. So that's good. We then wait until the booster lands and sort of settles, right? Now, we need to do it right after the booster lands. We can't wait until it gets all the way back to port because sometimes they tend to move around in rough seas. But we'll draw a line about where the center of the booster is, and then it just comes down to ratios. Imagine that the entire width from railing to railing is 100. How many percent are on this side, and how many percent end up on this side? And that gives us sort of a centering number, like 50 would be right in the middle. Just because you get into, okay, measuring the booster, what's the focal length of the camera, is it curved at all, etc., etc. Let's just stay away from that. So for the 84 landings where we could actually see the railings and get a good line on where the middle of the booster was, we put that into a table. It's sort of a distribution curve, right? There in the middle, you can see the normal distribution, assuming that it was all sort of there. You can actually see some outliers, maybe on the side. Interestingly, it seems like they trend a little bit more to the left, but we didn't go in and try to control for camera angles, like, oh, this camera always has the launch site behind you, sort of facing away, and the booster is coming over your head as you land. Stay away from that. Again, the important thing is how close to each railing it is and the percentage thereof. And you can see it does follow pretty much a curve. And once we've got the curve, we can get percentages. Now, the percentages here are where the middle of the booster ended up. Remember, we're just drawing a straight line down the middle of the booster. And you can see they're pretty darn accurate. 68% of the landings that we analyzed ended up within this circle. That's almost the center of the drone ship. 95% of the landings we analyzed ended up within this circle, still on the drone ship. And if you get all the way out here, 99.7% of the landings occur within this circle. You can start to see why their booster landings on drone ships and back at the LZ are so accurate. Quick note, we didn't put any LZ landings in the analysis because the camera angles tended to be a lot more variable. I mean, they have a ton of land around the LZ and they can sort of put cameras wherever, versus on the drone ship, you only have a certain number of railings that you can actually clamp those cameras to. Is there some difference between RTLS and drone ship landings? Not in this video. In all the landings we looked at, we had to exclude about 34 of them, but it did end us up with a good sample size. 84 landings. And we weren't really trying to get rid of outliers. Again, we know that in the past boosters have completely missed the drone ship, but we were looking at the most recent landings. So, for the Falcon 9 booster, SpaceX is hitting that target very consistently. No surprise there if you watch any of our streams. And we get into assumption mode. Can we take the accuracy of the Falcon 9 landings and apply them to Super Heavy? Clearly, they are way different size rockets. But for the sake of our analysis, because this is fun to think through, let's assume that SpaceX can get the big booster landings about as accurate as the small booster landings. Small. Falcon 9's not small. All right. Remember how big the drone ship is? Let's take the drone ship and apply it to the closed Chopsticks. You can see the Chopsticks are a little bit smaller than the drone ship. But you can see when the Chopsticks are closed, they're just over 9 meters wide. Well, that's where they have to be to catch the booster, right? And that's actually a lot smaller than the catchable area of the drone ship. When landing on the drone ship, you just have to get all 4 landing legs somewhere in that entire ball court. Aha, you might say, but the Chopsticks don't have to be all the way closed when the booster enters the Chopsticks. Hold up, we've seen this with the slap testing. They actually have the Chopsticks in an open position, and then they rapidly close them, and then sort of make contact with the side of the tank. Slap! We called it slap testing. So as the Chopsticks are there waiting for the booster, they don't have to be like this. They can actually open up a little bit. So that's going to increase what I'm going to call the catchable area on the Chopsticks. And you have a little bit of leeway in here as well, because the Chopsticks can move. We're going to talk more about this later. But since the Chopsticks are expected to be a little bit open whenever the booster bottom enters them, and then close as the booster gets down to landing, here's what it might be. Now, we've gauged this based on some of the slap testing and pantomime testing that we've seen occur, right? Where they raise the Chopsticks all the way up and they open them to a certain amount and then close them. This is not exact, but from a various different way of calculating them from various different camera angles, it's roughly 30 degrees. I mean, if you do cosine math, it's like maybe 29 degrees or 31 degrees. We're just going to roll with that. I don't need somebody in the comments, well, actually, it's 28.8. I mean, we're making some big assumptions for this video, but still, SpaceX has to solve these problems if they're ever going to have a chance of catching the booster. So let's roughly say it's about 30 degrees on each side from center, which is a total of 60 degrees, roughly. That's going to end up looking like this. There you go. That's a lot more catchable area that they can hit. Even though the Chopsticks can be this open when the booster enters them, they have to basically catch the booster by the ears. Not really. There's these little pins that stick out of the side on the top of the booster, right? So you can't just say, hooray, the booster made it between the Chopsticks. In between the time the bottom of the booster enters the Chopsticks and the pins pass the catching area of the Chopsticks, you've got to close those Chopsticks. But remember, these are all percentages. It's like a 60-70% chance the center of the booster ends up here. But when you add in the booster's diameter, that ends up looking like this. Sort of decreases your margins a little bit. And in that time, you've got to get those Chopsticks closed such that both of the pins sticking out either side of the booster are caught. So understanding all that, we're going to sort of describe the catchable area with this orange shape. Maybe the booster could be a little bit further away from the tower. Maybe the booster could be closer to the tower. The Chopsticks could be a little bit this way. The Chopsticks could be a little bit this way. But you haven't hit the Chopsticks, which is a good start. Now again, we're basing this orange area by the size of the catch rails that the pins are supposed to engage or be caught by. It doesn't necessarily mean that the tower or the Chopsticks could take the force of a landing booster way out here on the end. If you come in too close to the tower, it doesn't mean that you haven't impacted the tower and then corrected your position by the time you got to the Chopsticks. But again, let's forge ahead. So the booster hasn't hit the Chopsticks, but the pins need to be caught by the rails. So from this lab testing, it looks like they can in fact close the Chopsticks fast enough to get them under the pins while maintaining a larger possible catch area for the bottom of the booster to enter. But here we run into another problem that Falcon 9 on the drone ship does not have. You don't have pins all the way around the top of the booster. You just have two, one on either side. On the drone ship, you can rotate however you want. It doesn't matter where the landing legs are, as long as all four of them are on the ship. For the pins, the area that those pins have to touch down is way smaller than the surface of the drone ship. And here, the roll of the booster becomes ridiculously important. Check this out. As the Super Heavy booster rolls, the pins get further away from the rails. And in fact, if you're this far out of roll alignment, you miss. This is only based on rough visual estimates, but the pins stick out from the side of the booster only about 0.6, 0.7 meters. And those pin cylinders themselves take up part of that. So all in all, given the size of the pins and the size of the ears, it only gives us about 12 degrees of roll buffer, if you will, in each direction from center, for a total of 24 degrees. Now, how accurately can SpaceX control the roll during these landings? Not really easy to see by analyzing drone ship footage, unfortunately. Assuming your roll is within the margins, you've got the chopsticks closing together as the booster comes down. Well, how far are you from each booster? If you're right here in the middle and the chopsticks are moving at the same speed, you impact the booster on both sides at the same time. That's probably good. But what happens if you impact over here? You get into a situation where one chopstick has made contact before the other one has. Exactly where the booster is in that catchable area changes how the chopsticks need to move in order to catch it. Well, you say, why don't the chopsticks just push the booster into the right position? Now you've uncovered another problem, exactly where each chopstick makes contact with the booster body. What happens if you're a little off center and one chopstick makes contact before the other? Pardon my plush booster, it's not to scale and I didn't have time to paint it. Didn't have to paint it. But check this out. If one chopstick makes contact before the other, I don't know if you can see that, maybe we can do it in slow motion. It can actually impart a rotation to the booster. The booster has mass, right? And the center of mass of the booster is going to be somewhere. And it's sort of like where you can balance it. There's the center of mass. But on the actual booster, it's got engines in the bottom, which moves the center of mass this way. So for the purposes of my model, I've got to make contact here in the center of mass of the actual model. But if I hit it in the center of mass, I don't know if you're going to be able to see this. You sort of push the entire thing over. You don't impart a rotation, you just move the whole thing. But if you make contact above the center of mass, or heaven help you, below the center of mass, you get that rotation versus just pushing the whole thing sideways. Well, why is this important? Well, one way to possibly mitigate any rotation imparted to the body of the booster is to try and make contact close to the center of mass. Now, this may all be moot. Here, I don't have the force of the chopsticks, and I also don't know the inertia of the booster. There's so many variables in here, all you could really do is just guesstimate. They also might be able to tune the motion of each chopstick individually. It's not just start closing and hope the booster's in the middle. Maybe they can actually slow one down a little bit so that they still make contact at the same time. That's all going to come down to the telemetry that's being shared in real time between the booster coming in for a landing, or I guess a catch, and the control systems that are telling the chopsticks, yo, it's time to close. Here's how to do it. It'll be really interesting to see how this works out, but I bet you SpaceX has thought it through. Now, another thing about these massive amounts of energies that are being moved when the chopsticks and the rocket are in this huge dynamic system. What happens if you slap it a little too hard and the chopstick bounces off? We've seen some mitigation for that. In fact, I was referring to them as the steel Newtons or catch cushions or whatever you want to call them if you watch the daily videos. But we saw them install all of these bumpers along the area where the chopsticks is seemingly going to make contact with the booster. We can only guesstimate the exact operation of these, but it looks like they're crumple zones almost. So potentially the slap pads can absorb some of the force and make it more of a thud instead of a boing. Not technical terms. And that hopefully helps the chopsticks keep and maintain contact with the enemy, or I guess the booster, which isn't the enemy here. Well, it is the enemy if they don't catch it. All right, but what about vertical motion? If you look at these detailed photos of the catch rails, the rails raise up. And they have these dampers on them, sort of this big hydraulic system, and you can see that that is also going to help absorb some of the force. You really don't want to have a picture-perfect catch, but have a little bit too much vertical momentum and then bounce off the chopsticks. I think it's more likely that you rip the chopsticks off of the tower, but trying to mitigate and sort of damp out that vertical force is probably why they have these systems installed. Now, hydraulics seem rapidly reusable. Crush core bumper crumple zones? Maybe not. maybe they're springy. Maybe they're just trying to get the first catch down by any means possible. Rapid reusability will come. And as usual, after we recorded this video, there was late-breaking news. In a meeting that was publicly live-streamed, SpaceX's Bill Gerstenmaier said that the Flight 4 booster landing happened with 0.5 centimeter accuracy in the ocean. Here he is.
We landed with 0.5 centimeter accuracy in the ocean, so we think we have a reasonable chance to go back to the town.
Now, if he truly meant 0.5 centimeter, that's less than 1/5 of an inch. It's certainly possible that that's correct, but I can say this. The Falcon 9 landings that we analyzed did not land with that sort of accuracy consistently, unless it was the drone ship that was consistently meters out of position. Of course, he did also say, just sort of jokingly, that they're either going to catch it or they're going to take out the tower. But there's one way to find out. We'll see what happens. So let's hit all this in a whirlwind. If it's reasonable to assume that SpaceX Guidance and Navigation Systems, GNC, can get the Super Heavy booster about as close to the target center as the Falcon 9s can, they've got a pretty darn good chance of getting it inside the Chopsticks. But that's only the beginning of the things that have to go right for this to work. They have to make sure that both sides of the chopstick maintain contact with the booster. They have to make sure that the booster doesn't get any tilt or rotation that's imparted by being slapped by the chopsticks. They have to make sure the roll of the booster is close enough to get those pins above the rails so they can both engage. It has to hit the catch rails with just enough force so that it stays down, but it doesn't rip the rails off or rip the chopsticks off the tower or make the carriage become disconnected from the rails that it rides on. So those touchdown velocities are going to be important as well. And if all these things go right, you might have a successful catch of the Super Heavy booster. I'm sure we'll get a lot of comments down below with the flaws in the analysis because, hey, honestly, there are limitations. We're looking at video footage, not laser measured dimensions for all the landings. And the boosters are vastly different animals. But hey, I hope you have a better understanding of all the things that SpaceX has to sort out to make this whole let's catch a rocket thing work. If you learned something, let us know down below in the comments. If you think I'm way on base, hey, I've been on the internet for a long time. You can tell me that too, no hard feelings. Just be polite about it. Anyway you slice it, when SpaceX finally gives this wacky idea an attempt, I guarantee you it's going to be exciting to watch, and we'll be here to share it with you. If you want to make sure you don't miss those streams, make sure you click the sub button or whatever the kids are doing these days. For now, I'm John Galloway for NSF. We'll see you nerds later.